Welcome Taliah here in the studio, and John
Hello.
joining us from London. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Omar, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation with you and with Talia.
Yeah, I appreciate you both being here. And first, I want to start with something that it's really bothering me, and maybe you can answer the question for me. Is capitalism incompatible with climate change, with fighting climate change?
I think it's a question that is bothering a lot of people, Omar. I think the answer is, in its current form, yes, it is incompatible with effectively battling climate change. But in a different state, with different ways of thinking about economics and valuation and so on, I think capitalism is essential to fighting climate change. So we've got two battles at the same time, one to change capitalism and the other to deal with climate change.
And how is capitalism can be essential? Because I can see how it can be a deterrent, and we see it like almost every day, how it can transform to be essential.
Well, I think several things have to happen at the same time. One is that economics has chosen to ignore absolutely critical elements of the global ecological and environmental system. That cannot go on. We cannot simply treat what's happening to species around the world, oceans around the world, and to our climate and to our soils, for example, as simply as an externality, as something capitalists should not and do not worry about. They have to take these things into account. They have to price them properly, and then that system can almost work automatically to improve matters. But at the moment, we're not addressing that fundamental problem effectively.
I agree with you, John, that at the moment we are in bad shape, and that capitalism, and not only capitalism, actually doesn't relate and continues to cause harm to the environment. But at the end of the day, I think that if we look forward, I see capitalism as almost a different capitalism, perhaps, a more responsible one, perhaps the only answer to the environmental crisis, because I believe, and to climate change, because I believe that the built-in drive for success, for innovation, for creating financial value as well as other value, which is built in within capitalism, will drive capitalism to bring the solution and to create a sort of a medicine for the harms that we have done so far.
And we talked about capitalism as a general term, and I want to talk maybe about some specific companies or some kind of companies, specifically fossil fuel companies, oil companies, companies that are responsible for causing climate change. Can these kind of companies really transform themselves and to become companies that contribute to the fight against climate change? Because we see a lot of companies like Shell or Exxon and other companies that are talking about it. Can they really make the change and be more responsible and not so much polluting, or maybe not even polluting at all?
Well, two things, Omar. Firstly, we're talking about capitalism, but as you indicated, there are many forms of capitalism. If you go to China, you go to Saudi Arabia, you go to different parts of the world, you'll find that capitalism operates in very different ways, some of them more successful in terms of climate change. But the fossil fuels industry has been fighting a very determined, aggressive battle to almost stop what they're increasingly seeing as inevitable. And you've seen, for example, ExxonMobil, which is probably the company that has done most to lobby against effective action on climate change, losing 40% of its value over the last 18 months or so. And you've seen Chevron just in the last couple of days. I'm just picking initially US companies because they've been perhaps most resistant to effective action on climate change. Chevron has announced that it will get into decarbonization, renewable energy, these sorts of things. So, well, we should welcome that. But your question is, will they make a success of that? And I don't know. I think the jury is still out. I think we're seeing some European companies. You mentioned Shell, BP, these sorts of companies, again, are starting to talk about effective climate action and what they're going to do on all of that. And shifting away from fossil fuels as fast as we possibly can has to be the most important solution. And there are a number of companies which have gone completely away from fossil fuels. If you look in Denmark, for example, you have a company that used to be called Dong, now called Ørsted, which has gone completely to renewables and has actually been a runaway financial success. Now, that's not guaranteed, which is one of the reasons it's going to stop some of the big coal and oil companies moving in the right direction. But it can be done if you've got good management and effective leadership.
Actually, we've seen for years those companies that you have just mentioned, like Exxon and Shell and the others, announcing their sort of switching and investing in new energies and sustainable energies. And what's happening? Why don't they actually create the change? And why don't they move totally to new energies?
Well, Talia, just very quickly, I mean, I've worked with a number of those companies, particularly Shell and BP, and I've seen them go through these cycles of change. They embrace climate and action and sustainability and so on, and a new CEO comes in, or market sentiment changes, and then they shift. But you see exactly the same challenge in the automotive industry. I've worked with companies like Ford and Toyota, for example. You now have Tesla, at least the current market valuations, worth the same as the 5 top traditional automotive companies. So this is an astonishing change that's going through at the moment. And a lot of the big company managements are just frozen in the headlights. They don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm. John, do you see, if we put aside the sort of energy fuel companies, and we look at other industries, which are not considered the polluting ones, but obviously they contribute their own share to the climate crisis. Do you see their shift in business models, in new technologies, new processes, as solving part of the problem?
Well, we all live in hope. We hope that things will get better and relatively quickly. The answer to your question is yes, I do. So, for example, if I look at the financial markets, which are absolutely critical now, Talia, as you well know, you've got green bonds, sustainability bonds, social bonds, all sorts of instruments starting to come through. You've got banks with, for example, working with the UK Parliament with an initiative called Bankers for Net Zero. And these are banks trying to think about how do they adapt their lending policy to support net zero focused action by small and medium-sized enterprises and so on. And if you go to a sector like food and agriculture, for example, you're starting to see real attention being paid to what people call regenerative agriculture. So it's not just simply mining soils. I mean, in much of the developed world, it's now thought that there is about 60 years worth of harvest still to be had before we get dust bowls, before the soils collapse and disappear. And I think that regenerative trend we talk about the regenerative economy, we talk about regenerative capitalism. To some degree, we're sort of being hopeful in that. But I think it's possible. I think it's beginning to happen. But I think we need to accelerate it. And I think governments have a very important role to play in that.
I want to talk about another aspect of a corporation or companies. And I believe it was Milton Friedman who popularized the notion that companies should maximize value to shareholders. And in many ways, it's guided capitalism over the last few decades. And more recently, we've seen companies talking about social responsibility, environmental responsibility. How important or significant are those trends? Are they just talk, or really are companies really starting to change and reevaluate the way they generate value, not just as value for shareholders, but also value for the environment, for the community, for the country they are operating in?
Can I answer?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sorry. I think we are, first of all, I must say, admit I get sort of edgy when Milton Friedman is put on the table, because I'm sure that had he been here today, he would have changed his conception, and would agree that creating value for shareholders, even for shareholders, can't be done today without looking at the wide picture of the challenges of our world, of the social challenges, the environmental challenges, the political challenges. I think, you can't just ignore and just look with straightforward and say, well, I want to create only value for shareholders. You must take into account the wide picture.
John,
and I think that, sorry.
John, what do you think about it?
Well, I think like many prophets, Milton Friedman was a very intelligent man, exactly as Thalia said. If he was here now, he would have reconsidered, I'm sure. But many of his disciples used his thoughts and bent them to serve their own purposes. And he was a very intelligent man. I mean, he basically said, you focus on your shareholder at a time when people really weren't doing that. And that was a necessary message to business. But we've now had 50 years of Friedmanism, if I can call it that. And I think we're beginning to realize, and certainly many business leaders are realizing that this isn't working, that in some critical respects, focusing simply on consumer and investor needs can be a recipe for short-term success. But if you're really starting to think about some of the bigger crises that we're facing, and this isn't just climate change, although that is shockingly central, I think, going forward, but it's things like Facebook undermining democracy. I mean, I think what we're seeing is this model of single bottom line capitalism taken to its extreme, getting to the point where we know we've got to take it down. We know we've got to take it apart. We know we've got to rebuild it.
Yeah. John, you actually taught me to be optimistic, and it's not so easy nowadays. But I really believe when answering your question, Omer, I really believe that corporate responsibility or regenerative capitalism or conscious capitalism, there are so many different definitions. But at the end of the day, we are talking about a journey. And I think there is no way back. It's a journey that creates, sometimes perhaps not for the right reason, but at the end of the day, it creates the change. I definitely agree with the fact that we must accelerate it. We can't just sit and discuss and think what we are going to do. We must do things. But there are different ways to get to that compass. And to continue this journey. It takes time. We have to accelerate it. But when we look at the Z generation, the younger generations, when we look at the new consumers, when we look at the technology, and if all that is being tied together, I think we will definitely succeed in creating that change.
John, we are nearly out of time. Maybe just one final word from you to sum up the discussion we had here today.
Well, I think what's happening, and I absolutely agree with Thalia, there's a younger generation coming up now at every level in our societies, and they think different. They really see climate change as an existential threat to their futures. I've been on the climate marches with some of the school strikers inspired by Greta Thunberg. And I think I'm hopeful because I think as a species, we tend to do our best work when we're backed into a corner. And on climate and soils and oceans and all of these big issues, we've backed ourselves into the mother of all corners. And I think innovation is now going to go exponential. It already is. And we're seeing a growing focus among younger entrepreneurs on how do you not just do things in a responsible manner, but how do you do it over time in a regenerative manner? I think it's immensely exciting. and we should give these people every support we possibly can.
Thank you, John and Talia, for being with us today.
Thank you, Omer. Thank you, John.
A great pleasure. Thank you both.